Hello and welcome back to the Life on the Wrist podcast. We're going to discuss a few things that have come up in the news related to watch collecting, watch enthusiasm during this episode of the podcast. Next week we will discuss 4 new vintage watches that will be covered on the Life on the Wrist YouTube channel as well as lifeonthewrist.com. So stay tuned for that. We've got some very exciting pieces in, super interesting, cool dials, cool case designs. It really is a nice sort of array of watches that I've really enjoyed. But as I mentioned, we're going to be discussing watch news during this podcast. Obviously, the summertime for watch collecting can be a little bit slow. Many brands don't release too many new watches, but there have been some pretty exciting things that have come about both on the modern and vintage side of things. I'll start off with something that happened at the beginning of August where a very cool Omega was spotted on the wrist of brand ambassador Daniel Craig at the Olympic Omega House in Paris. If you don't know, Daniel Craig is the most recent James Bond, and with that came a ambassadorship to Omega as a brand, and there are many Bond Seamasters that have been released that were used in some of the films that he was a part of. Nevertheless, this sort of relationship is pretty iconic, and I think the last time we spoke about Daniel Craig and Omega was in a podcast where it was spotted that there was a white dial Speedmaster on his wrist that was not released. And it was kind of this very interesting time where an ambassador was showcasing a watch on their wrist when Omega had not released it. This time, a similar thing has happened. Big shout out to Gear Patrol, who was able to actually spot this on the wrist of Daniel Craig. But what we have, and based on the pictures that we've seen, is a 60th anniversary Seamaster 300. But it has what's interesting about this piece is that it appears that it is a no-date version of the Seamaster 300. Additionally, the watch has a different type of dive bezel, where it looks like instead of having the 60 on the bezel at the top, there's the dive-appropriate pip, and also the hands and indices are white rather than Lollipop seconds hands. It seems like it has kind of a very traditional seconds hand of the Seamaster 300. It looks to be a black dial, black bezel version of this watch, and Gear Patrol sort of hypothesizes that it's likely that this watch probably has a different crystal and possibly a ceramic bezel, given some of the direction that I guess the brand has sort of gone with many of their watches in recent years. What's interesting is this is obviously the first version of this watch being seen on Daniel Craig's wrist, but there are historical records of these watches being made for the U.S. Secret Service, made for everyone from the U.S. Secret Service to Denmark's Naval Special Forces, and also I think there was one seen being worn by King Frederick of Denmark. I think it was a custom piece. So what this really would be is there's a possibility that this is a piece that's going to be mass produced by Omega for the broader market. It's quite interesting. This is the second time in which Daniel Craig has been spotted with an unreleased watch, and then the white dial Speedmaster was released eventually, and it's quite an interesting tactic because I think there's a lot very specific rules for brand ambassadors when it comes to wearing pieces that possibly are not released yet, and I think a lot goes into sort of the planning of that, and it does appear that as time sort of goes on, it seems like this is a very common thing, or not common, this is the second time that this has happened, and it might be a way in which Omega spurs up interest for these very unique and special pieces. I have not personally owned a Seamaster 300 in my personal collection, but I have worn them. They're a great alternative to Rolex Submariners. I really like the fact that it's a no-date version and that it's black on black. I think that actually makes it a little bit more versatile and interesting to more than one collector. So quite an exciting release. I'll leave a link in the show notes of this podcast, as I always do, to where you can read more about this specific piece. Another bit of watch news, or a watch that was released, is the Hodinkee and Tag Heuer collaboration that was released. The watch that they released was the Tag Heuer Carrera chronograph Seafarer, obviously in collaboration with Hodinkee. What's really interesting about this, and I'll kind of just read some of the marketing that Hodinkee put out about this. It's a thoroughly modern Carrera, but with a design ethos of one of our very favorite and most notable vintage Heuer references. Maintaining the color codes and bezel aesthetics from 1968, this collaboration embraces the modern spirit of Tag Heuer. What you have here is a Tag Heuer chronograph that has a 42mm case and has the Seafarer dial that is iconic of a vintage Heuer. To give you a little bit more information about this piece, around 1947 or 1948, Heuer was approached by Abercrombie & Fitch with a request to design a watch that would enable hunters, fishermen, and sailors to leverage John Alden Knight's solunar theory. This theory could predict when fish or game are most likely to be active based on the alignment of the sun and the moon. Similarly, as the moon controls the tide, the same concept could help to predict periods of low and high tides at sea. Knight published a series of charts each year showing the days of the month and time of day that would be most favorable for hunting and fishing. And so Tag Heuer ended up producing this. They were able to create a complication to accurately record the information needed, which was essentially a dial that slowly rotated every 59 days, exactly twice the duration of the 29.5-day lunar cycle. The tide indicator could be updated to match local tide tables with simple actuation of an added pusher at 4 o'clock. The first iteration of the watch featured a subtle cream dial and a Technicolor sundial at 6 that rotated throughout the day to indicate periods of high and low tides. Thus, the solunar was born. This is very interesting sort of, development in complications. It's a good reminder that functionality was really the at the core of why this watch was produced. And if you look at the historical versions of this piece, they really are beautiful vintage pieces. What this collaboration did was use the 1968 version of the Abercrombie & Fitch Seafarer reference 2446C, updated it to be a little bit more modern. They did increase the size to 42 millimeters, which is, to some very wearable, some might be a little bit on the larger side. It's updated for the modern eras, is what I would really say. There's a really good article on Hodinkee that kind of walks through the complication and also how to use the watch. It's really, really a cool complication. It's nice to see these in this complication in a modern watch. You don't really get these types of complications. As you know, I'm a big fan of blue dials, the Memo Sail Yacht Timer being one of my favorite watches ever produced. And so the blue accents on this piece really do speak to me quite nicely. It was they were selling it for $8,000 USD, and I believe, let's see, I'm going to quickly go on the Hodinkee website to see if there are any of these available. I believe that they were produced in a limited quantity. But let's see what would happen if I... okay, well, right now I'm trying to add the watch to my cart, but it doesn't say sold out. So I'm not really sure if there are any available of this piece. I really have no clue. I do know that there was a lot of buzz about this watch on Instagram, and a lot of people picked these up. So I would hasten to guess that they're probably they might be close to the end of their stock. It does look like, I just went to my cart, it does look like I'm able to actually purchase one of them. So there are some that are still left. I don't know how many of these are being produced, but I encourage you to check it out because it is a cool complication, even if it's maybe on the larger side for you. So that sort of covers the modern side of watches that I wanted to talk about during this podcast. What I wanted to shift towards is vintage watches. There have been some quite interesting news that have come out. Firstly, the last Steve McQueen Heuer Monaco from the movie Le Mans is coming to auction. This is a very exciting time. During the shooting of the movie Le Mans, Steve McQueen was, I believe, there were six Heuer Monacos that were used as props during this shooting. 4 of them were on leather straps, and McQueen is actually seen in many pictures wearing these specific watches. The 2 of them are in the Tag Heuer Museum. One sold in 2012 for $799,500 and the other one sold in 2009 for just shy of $88,000. The third Monaco that McQueen used during the filming was given to his personal mechanic, Haig Altoninian. Probably pronounced it incorrectly, I apologize. On the final day of the shooting of Le Mans, and that sold in 2020 at Phillips for $2.2 million. So if you compare that to the previous time that one of these sold, it was in 2012, and you're looking at an additional $1.4 million. And so now the fourth version of this watch is coming up at auction, I believe at Sotheby's in December for the New York sale, which is quite exciting. It's estimated to go between $500 and $1 million. It's the first time this example has appeared publicly, and really, when you think about it, it might be the last time that one of these McQueen Monacos comes up from the shooting of Le Mans. The $2.2 million figure that the last one sold at Phillips, it's going to be interesting to see what will happen with this piece. I do think that in 2020, vintage Heuer, I think really vintage chronographs in general were extremely popular, hence the really high figure that watch ended up selling for. This year, I think this summer, there's been a little bit of an uptick in vintage Heuer. I was listening to the Hodinkee podcast with Eric Wind, actually. Tony Chen and Eric Wind were on the Hodinkee podcast kind of talking about the market, and I think Eric was saying that he had a lot of vintage Heuer sort of sit for quite a while, and then all of a sudden they were kind of sold. And so maybe there's some sort of resurfacing interest in vintage Heuer chronographs. We'll have to see what it ends up selling for. If I was to bet, I probably think the 2.2 might be I don't think it will go for that much. I think the estimate is pretty spot on in my mind. I think it might go between maybe a little bit above $1 million, but of course we'll have to wait to December to see if I am correct or not. It's so hard to predict these things, especially with provenance and very limited production pieces. The provenance of this makes it even more limited, which is quite an interesting factor. I'm not talking to all the Heuer enthusiasts or Steve McQueen fans or Le Mans fans, so not really sure what it will end up selling for, but we'll have to see. Just have to wait and see, and I think that's kind of what makes collecting vintage watches quite exciting. The last watch I wanted to talk about, which is very, very exciting, is a Movado calendograph that was formerly owned by Winston Churchill, was listed for sale. It's being sold by Peter Harrington in London. It's currently listed for $150,000 US. The watch is a very, so just to backtrack maybe, Winston Churchill is obviously one of the best, most well-known leaders and an icon when it comes to many different facets of life, whether that has to do with his leadership skills, his collecting of watches, his interest in his sort of his sartorial interests, and or his diplomacy. It's been known that he's owned a couple of different watches throughout his life, and some of them have sold at auction. The watch that is being sold by Peter Harrington is a Movado calendograph in 18-karat yellow gold, dating to September 1946. The calendograph was sort of a flagship model for Movado in this period, and they were really competing with a lot of the other rivals during this time, Swiss watch rivals. This Movado was actually gifted by Heuer in Zurich, and what's really beautiful about this specific reference, which is the 44820, is that it has these sort of turtle lugs, which is fairly unique for these Movado calendographs. What's really cool is if you turn the watch over, there's a beautiful inscription on the case back that says, "To Winston Churchill, as testimony of the admiration and gratitude of some Swiss citizens, September 1946. This is a truly iconic piece, and I think an absolutely incredible honor to be able to sell this watch and hopefully find a new home for it. This watch was gifted to Churchill on a trip that he had in Switzerland. He was traveling with his wife, and the trip was from August 23rd to September 20th. And they stayed on Lake Geneva, they stopped in Bern, and they ended up going to Zurich at the end of the trip. On September 19th, 1946, Churchill actually delivered one of his most memorable post-war speeches, where he called for the United States of Europe. There was a Lamania watch that he was also given during that trip, and that watch ended up selling for 162,500 pounds. So, have to see what ends up happening with this piece. When the article that I'm referencing is on Hodinkee, I encourage you to go check it out. There's a link to the website where it's actually being sold. There are a couple of editor notes where the watch was removed briefly because of a possible sale, but it's now been relisted, at least as of when I was recording this podcast. There's also a really cool note from Heuer with information about this piece. So it kind of all checks out and is a pretty iconic piece, important provenance, especially for those who are interested in Winston Churchill. As always, there'll be links in the show notes to all of the topics that we discuss during this podcast. So I encourage you to go to the show notes of this podcast or the description of this video if this is on YouTube, or if you're listening to this on YouTube, to see those, see the watches that we're talking about, or reference some of the pictures that we may be discussing on this podcast. That about wraps it up for this episode of the Life on the Wrist podcast. Be sure to follow this podcast and check out our social media. There'll be links in the description to all of our social medias, as well as to lifeonthewrist.com and the Life on the Wrist YouTube channel. We recently got into TikTok, kind of an interesting, I know we kind of explored TikTok briefly a couple of years ago, and kind of wanted to get back into it. I think the mode of video is such a powerful thing, and being able to share vintage watches with you in that mode is an exciting thing as well. But there'll be a link to that in the description of this video. If you are new, as I said, follow us and share this episode with a friend who might be interested in watches. If you wouldn't mind rating this podcast, it also does help me out very much. And with this, guys, thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and until next time.